In the United States in January, we were shaken by how Renee Good and Alex Pretty died in the streets of Minneapolis. In Iran, something like this might have happened in the same month, much more systematically and much more deliberately to more than 30,000 people. That means that tens of thousands of families in Iran are mourning their loved ones right now, the way Renee Good and Alex Pretty's family are mourning theirs. The photos that have emerged of piles of dead bodies are profoundly disturbing. Such atrocities raise deep questions about the legitimacy of the regime, as well as also of that of the Revolutionary Guards, the parallel security apparatus that has amassed vast political and economic power over the decades. Under Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, the leader of the 1979 revolution, and Ali Khamenei, who succeeded him in 1989 and continues to be in power, responses to internal resistance have always been fierce. Iran is notorious for its prisons, especially Evin Prison in Tehran. This is one place where the regime sends the courageous individuals who defy its overbearing power, including members of our panel here tonight. Let me mention one person who is obviously not here, but is currently imprisoned in Iran, and that is Narges Mohammadi, Vice President of the Defenders of Human Rights Center headed by Shirin Ebadi. Narges Mohammadi has been a vocal proponent of mass feminist civil disobedience and an equally vocal critic of hijab and chastity programs. She has been imprisoned with little interruption since 2016 and has reported on abuse and solitary confinement of detained women. In October 2023, while in prison, she was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, a truly worthy recipient of that prize, alongside Shirin Ebadi before her. And the citation there, the quote is, "For her fight against the oppression of women in Iran and her fight to promote human rights and freedom for all," end quote. If we can believe in the resilience of the human spirit, as I do think we can, it is very much because of human rights activists like Narges Mohammadi and members of our panel tonight. But since I just now spoke of the resilience of the human spirit, it would be remiss of me not to also give a nod of recognition, gratitude, and admiration to the people of Ukraine. After all, it is today, February 24th, that marks the 4th anniversary of the brutal large-scale Russian invasion. Human freedom is defended in lots of places at the same time. But let me return to Iran. Currently, we are awaiting possible American strikes against Iran, which could literally happen any minute. The history of US-Iran difficulties over the decades is not just a string of misunderstandings. It is a cycle of real confrontations and grievances. US interventions and regime change behavior have bred deep Iranian distrust, not just in ruling circles. And Iran's revolutionary theocratic ideology and support for armed groups have fed US and, of course, also very much Israeli and other regional fears about terrorism and instability. Ill-considered intervention at this stage might greatly worsen the human rights situation in Iran. Iran, I should say, has long mattered a great to me personally, and I had the privilege of visiting just a few years ago. I could walk the markets of Tehran and experience how normal it is for cars to break down on highways because people barely manage the upkeep. I could see the Zoroastrian sites in Yazd, visit Persepolis, and appreciate that Isfahan indeed once was half the world. Iran is one of the great cultural nations of our world, and the Iranian people deserve so much better than what they have been exposed to in recent decades. Our panelists, of course, have experienced these realities firsthand, so please allow me now to introduce them and then hand over to the moderator. That moderator is Jared Genser, an international human rights lawyer and a member of the advisory board of the Carl Ryan Center for Human Rights. The New York Times calls him the extractor for his work freeing political prisoners. He served as a pro bono counsel to our panelist Siamak Namazi when Namazi was an American hostage in Iran. And previously, Jared also represented several prominent Iranian political prisoners. Our first panelist is Dr. Neda Bolourchi, who is the executive director of the Public Affairs Alliance of Iranian-Americans and a non-resident senior fellow at the Institute for Global Affairs at Eurasia Group. A former human rights attorney, she has advised the US Departments of Defense, the State Department, diplomatic missions, senior government officials, and multinational corporations on geopolitical risk, sanctions, and regional security dynamics. Our second panelist is Dr. Hadi Ghaemi, who is the founder and executive director of the Center for Human Rights in Iran. The center has been a leading organization documenting and advocating for human rights in Iran and on the global stage for nearly 2 decades. Previously, Hadi was the Iran and UAE researcher at Human Rights Watch, and before that, he was a professor of physics at City University in New York. Siamak Namazi, our third panelist, is a former senior strategy executive turned keynote speaker on high-stakes decision-making under extreme uncertainty. He was held hostage in Iran from 2015 to 2023. And then finally, our fourth panelist is Morad Tahbaz, the co-founder of the Persian Wildlife Heritage Foundation. Prior to serving 6 years in prison as a hostage in Iran from 2018 to 2023, he had focused the international community on the critical importance of protecting unique biodiversity and habitats in which iconic Persian wildlife species thrive. Thank you to all of you for being here this evening with us, and now over to you, Jared.
Good evening, and thanks, Matthias, and thanks to the Institute of Politics and the Carl Ryan Center for Human Rights for hosting this timely and important event. Over the past 3 years, many longstanding assumptions about the Iranian regime's strength and regional dominance have been shaken. The end of the Gaza war and decimation of Hamas has dramatically altered regional dynamics. Hezbollah, long considered Iran's most powerful proxy and strategic deterrent, has been severely degraded. Israel has carried out unprecedented direct strikes on Iranian targets, and the U.S. has also conducted military operations linked to Iran's regional activities and nuclear program. For decades, the Islamic Republic projected an image of strategic patience, deterrence depth, and internal control. Today, that image looks far more fragile. The regime appears more exposed regionally, more economically strained domestically, and more reliant on repression than at any point in recent memory. Inside Iran, as Matthias was describing, the human rights situation has deteriorated sharply. Following nationwide protests, security forces responded with lethal force. Tens of thousands may have been murdered in the most recent crackdown, including children. Thousands have been detained, and executions have surged, reaching some of the highest numbers in recorded years. The government has repeatedly shut down or throttled the internet, attempting to sever communications between protesters and the outside world, turning the country off digitally during moments of peak unrest. At the same time, Iran's economy is under extraordinary pressure. The rial has plummeted to historical lows, down 50% from early 2024. Annual inflation exceeded 50% in 2025 alone, and food prices have gone up 70% for essential goods. Youth unemployment exceeds 20%. Many professionals and students are seeking exit rather than reform. The middle class, once considered a stabilizing force, has been hollowed out. Sanctions play a role, but so does corruption, mismanagement, and structural economic distortions that are really paramount. And yet the regime persists. So tonight we'll address 4 central questions. What is truly happening on the ground in Iran? Has the regime become more vulnerable or more dangerous in this moment of geopolitical flux? Is there any realistic path to a U.S.-Iran nuclear diplomacy amid military threats and distrust? And perhaps most consequentially, when Ali Khamenei dies, and all dictators eventually do, does the system endure or unravel? We're fortunate to have panelists who bring lived experience, frontline documentation, strategic analysis, and extraordinary resilience. And this conversation will move between the policy and the personal, and between structure and survival. So let's get to it. Let me begin with you, Neda. Women have repeatedly led acts of defiance, from removing hijabs to organizing digitally despite shutdowns. Just yesterday, the world saw images of hundreds of young women at the conservative Shelabala Women's College protesting the ongoing refusal by the regime to simply recognize their school as an independent university, demanding equal status with men's universities. Despite the violence, the state seems unable to fully suppress this broader political and cultural rebellion. Do you believe Iranian society has psychologically moved beyond the regime, even if the regime still controls the guns? And what does that gap mean as you see things?
Thank you so much for that question, Jared, and for having me this evening, and hello to everyone who's with us. I greatly appreciate the focus on the women who continue protesting as they have since 1979. So I don't, everyone I think will probably remember the Women Life Freedom Movement, but just as a historian, I recall that women in Iran have been fighting for 47 years. In regards to your question about psychologically moving beyond the regime, My answer is yes. I think definitely you have a significant portion that have moved psychologically beyond the regime. But I think the more important shift is not psychological per se, it's structural. For the first time since 1979, the Islamic Republic no longer governs through a mix of ideology and coercion. It governs almost exclusively, as we're increasingly seeing, through coercion. And so there's been a collapse of what we as political theorists and historians call normative legitimacy. And I don't think anyone here is going to disagree with that. And so this is why you see women removing hijab not as an episodic protest anymore, but as daily civil disobedience. You see it in the youth culture that no longer performs loyalty rituals. You see it in the quiet refusal to internalize the moral vocabulary of the state. And so I think this is really important in the sense of how often it is that the regime has responded to these steps and these phases and this erosion. It's not simply an increased repression. It has begun redefining citizenship itself. And so what that means is over the past several years, we've seen the systematic effort to strip away the concept of equal citizenship. This is a long-standing practice of the Islamic Republic, but we really see it pronounced in the last several years, where it has replaced the concept of equal citizenship with a hierarchy of political worth. My own research on this from the Woman Life Freedom movement has examined how the state increasingly classifies individuals not as rights-bearing citizens, but as categories. They're loyalists, they're martyrs, they're security defenders on one side, and that those groups are against rioters, corruptors, foreign agents on the other side. And what's so important is from the human rights element is that as foreign agents, as corruptors, they're then denying Iranians the rights as if a judicial system had actually existed. They're denying them those rights. And so you now are seeing this even at another level since January with recent narratives around martyrdom. And the regime is distinguishing between different types of martyrs, those who die defending the system, those who die in regional conflicts, those tied to internal unrest, and assigns them different symbolic and material value. And so what appears rhetorically, foreign agents, martyrs, is actually structural. The benefits, the recognition, the state protection flows unevenly, and also human rights are stripped unevenly. And so as a part of this reclassification project, citizenship, not that it was universal, but it really is poignantly no longer universal, it's conditional. And once citizenship becomes conditional, again, rights are revocable. And so I think that's the deeper structural shift that we're seeing just in the most horrendous ways, where the state is moving from governance over citizens to governance over categories of loyalty. And so does society see through this? Absolutely. The psychological break is real. Large segments of Iranian society no longer view the regime as, and we've talked about percentages as analysts, and that they've increasingly gone down. And I think we're at an agreement about 15% being representative. But the loss of legitimacy also doesn't equal collapse, I think, importantly. When we're talking about the protests and you're talking about the women at the universities and we're on day 4, authoritarian systems continue to persist, as you mentioned in your introductory remarks. And so I think in regards to human rights, the continuation of protests, and these structural shifts around psychology and human rights, right now the security apparatus remains unified. Elites are material invested in that. And so as the protests are ongoing, the power structure is holding, unfortunately. So I think the gap between the state, as it were, and society is immensely brittle, because the coercive capacity is intact, and that brittleness is governing without consent, and it's governing without inclusion. which means that the social contract is frayed. So I'm going to stop there on human rights and the social contract and that gap between state and society and how it's fraying.
Thanks so much, Neda. That was very, very helpful. Now turning to Hadi, over the last wave of protests, security forces, as we all know, responded with lethal force, mass detentions, widespread internet shutdowns, executions have surged, and repression is now much more widespread and systematic than episodic. I'm curious to have your views on kind of a very simple question, which is, at this stage, do you see the Islamic Republic governing exclusively through fear? And obviously, as a human rights expert who's been following Iran your entire life, and most especially for the last 20 years, do you see signs that repression is becoming more or less effective? Because I think from the outside, it's really hard to discern what's really going on.
Okay. Hello, Jared. Let me also start by saying hi to you and the organizers of this event, as well as my wonderful co-panelists. It's an honor to be with you, and I'm sorry we could not be together in person. These are indeed historical times in Iran, Jared. I want to build on Neda's excellent analysis over the concept of state and society in Iran, especially in the last decade. But I also want to share what my understanding is of how people in Iran are viewing what happened on January 8 and 9. I'm afraid those of us outside have not quite grasped the singularity, the rupture, the significance of what was an unprecedented massacre, genocide, and crimes against humanity of greatest order. We're talking about 20 to 30,000 citizens massacred over 2 nights, not during any armed conflict or violent uprising or confrontational situation. But these were families, children, entire families who were walking out of their home to join their other citizens who wanted to protest that night in the larger centers of the city. And they were massacred on their doorsteps, on their local streets, so that they cannot reach the larger crowds. This was very premeditated, systematic, intentional massacre that shook the country, and the rage, I don't think we quite understand it because the regime shut down the internet and didn't allow coverage of it in real time. And our understanding of it is delayed, fragmented, and still not complete. So just to put this in the historical context of Iran's own history, I really cannot find anything similar to it, maybe going back to 1794, when the founder of Qajar dynasty, Agha Muhammad Khan Qajar, massacred large number of civilians in the city of Kerman as he fought his last battle against the previous dynasty to consolidate his rule. That's more than 230 years ago. So psychologically, for Iranians, who are a very proud people and believe of 3 millenniums of civilization, this kind of event is a complete historical shock. And the analysis I hear, the view of the government, not only there is a rupture, not only there is a brittle gap between the state and society, the view of the ruling class is now one of an occupying power, similar to Vichy France. Maybe the Vichy regime was French people ruling over parts of France, but we know that it never represented the interests of the French people. The other thing I hear is how now the regime is viewed as standing not only on coercion, but on 3 fundamental ideological concepts. 2 of them have been there all along, debt to Israel, debt to America, but now people very much believe it's also debt to Iran. The way the country and its economy, politics, society has been brought to the edge of abyss, and the way its own citizens have been massacred and treated the way that Neda described, as in categories of sub-citizens or subhuman beings, basically, who do not have universal rights. All of this means that the regime is now almost looked at as a foreign presence that must be, historically, it's our responsibility to uproot it. Now, it does still have all means of coercion. It does have still revenue of oil money. And the people do not have much support. But my understanding is that this singularity has led to a new era where the people inside, together with the diaspora outside, are going to do their best to uproot this regime, which does not represent any interests of Iran or Iranians, especially after this January massacre.
Thanks so much, Hadi. Siamak, let me turn to you. Iran's economy, as I was noting, is battered by inflation, currency collapse, capital flight, and deep structural mismanagement. Sanctions matter some, but corruption and governance failure are endemic. And I'd be interested to hear your views about what the regime's greatest vulnerability are today. Is it geopolitical, or is it repression and economic collapse from within? And how longer can this current model sustain political control?
Thank you, Jared. Explaining what a surreal moment this is for me right now, being on this panel. Jared, of course, was my pro bono lawyer who dedicated the better part of a decade fighting to get me out of that hellhole and making sure that I'm here today. He's truly a superhero in the flesh. Morad was my cellmate for years, and he's family at this point. And Hadi, of course, was and his organization were relentless defenders of us and all the political prisoners in Iran. So thank you, Hadi. And of course, this is a deeply emotional time for all Iranians, dual nationals included, while we're seeing the regime killing its own people in ways so gruesome that, that let's say it leaves no illusions as to the true nature of that beastly regime. Now, going to your question, Evin Prison, the place I spent 8 years in, is often referred to as Evin University, because that's where you see how the regime actually works. You end up there with senior members of the regime who fell foul of usually some economic interest, human rights defenders, lawyers, journalists, really, you name it. And there's actually a joke about Evin University, which is that the alumni connections are rival that of Harvard's. And I think that's partially true. The core takeaway, one of the core takeaways of that, the 8 years spent at that university, is that this regime is far more corrupt and there's far more mismanagement than we imagine. I mean, some of the things that Morad and I have seen, the people we've interacted with, it really blows your mind of how's this thing standing. Let's take the banking sector, for example. Iran's banking sector is insolvent, period. Nearly every single bank, and I'm not exaggerating. Why? Just look at the way the loan system works. The big loans are handed out through they're greased through bribery, and essentially the person goes and gives a highly inflated valued property deed to secure these loans. They don't ever intend to give it back. So when the loan becomes due, the bank takes over this deed, which is, 1/10 of its the value that is booked there. And what does the bank do? It simply sells it on to the next bank, tax on an even more inflated value. Now, why does the next bank buy it? Because it does exactly the same thing with its toxic junk. And so it's like a closed loop Ponzi scheme. Now, insolvency doesn't disappear just because you learn how to cook the books. What I'm trying to say is that's just the banking sector. The entire economic structure that I witnessed is run the exact same way. It's just as rotten and it's just as corrupt. So what happens is you end up with structural decaying and deep rot. That's what you were describing, Jared. Water running out, the power grid failing, the currency collapsing, inflation. Really, the only things booming in Iran, besides corruption and cruelty, is misery, morgues, prisons. Those are the expanding sectors. But what we're seeing is institutionalized hollowing, because the regime has made a point to value loyalty over competence and obedience over capability. Now, violence can replace governance, to go to Neda's earlier point, but I would say only to a point. I'd argue that the scale of the regime's recent violence is proof that we've passed that point. And I definitely concur with Hadi's assessment that there's no coming back from that. That's a permanent loss of legitimacy, and that regime needs to go. So to answer your question more directly, I would say the status quo is just simply no longer viable. Now, I wouldn't bet on democracy replacing whatever comes next, whatever system it is. I think for the next months and years, we're entering a volatile period, but I would bank on this. That which cannot continue won't.
Thanks so much, Siamak, and for your keen observations as well. Last but definitely not least, Morad, I'd like to turn to you. You, of course, like Siamak, survived many years in Evin Prison under conditions designed to isolate and break detainees. As the two of you know best, the regime uses hostage-taking and imprisonment as key tools of statecraft. And I wanted to ask you, what does prolonged detention teach you about how the system thinks? And what misconceptions do you think policymakers abroad might still have about how the regime uses hostages as part of its strategic thinking?
Thank you, Jared, and thank you for including me on this panel. Thank you for Harvard creating this opportunity for us to be here today. That is, Jared, a very complex question, because the tiers in which detainees are kept are, I don't know whether I could list all of the tiers. I think for the purposes of this panel, I think it's best just focus on the dual nationals or the hostages taken for negotiations with the US, EU, the UK, etc. But generally, I mean, this whole business started obviously with the takeover of the US Embassy. And what the Iranians were at that time able to get out of the United States, and even more so, essentially were one of the main causes for bringing down Jimmy Carter on a re-election campaign. So I mean, right there and then, it became a proven, very despicable, but a proven methodology of statecraft for them. And they've continued to do this ever since. And as I said, there's the different categories, but you taking foreign nationals is a method of gaining leverage over those countries that they feel are their enemies, or that they want to extract something from. And how it starts, just so I think that people understand how this works. The Islamic Republic, they typically concoct a story and then start feeding it in bits to the media, which obviously is all state-controlled. In essence, they create the story that there was some suspicious history before the arrest, and this just was not a random taking of or detaining somebody. And by the time this person is arrested, they've created enough media presence about the arrest that everybody thinks you've done something. There's this general notion that this guy, he must have done something or he wouldn't be here. I mean, in my own case, I can't speak about everyone's cases, but in my own case, I was arrested by the IRGC intelligence organization, as did the Siamak. And in my case, it was a campaign initially of attacking and undermining the Rouhani government, which was viewed as a reformist kind of group that were trying to come to terms with the West. And of course, as you all know, Khamenei and the people around him have always been very much against that. So they started targeting some of the government agencies who were educated in the West and the U.S. in specific. They launched a campaign against the Iranian Department of Environment, who's the head of which was educated at University of California at Davis. So they didn't make much headway on that. So they zeroed in on our conservation foundation that I had co-founded, which at that time had been in operation for 10 years. And this was the largest conservation foundation by far in the country, very visible, very transparent. And, you know, everything we did had been run through various government agencies. So, I mean, there was nothing really there, but nevertheless, they created this whole story, given my British and American citizenship as well as Iranian, that I was the coordinator, or in their own words, the bridge between the CIA, MI6, and Mossad. You know, so I became a pawn of the IRGC, both in undermining the Rouhani government, as well as them gaining a hostage or a pawn in dealing with the American and British governments, who they were owed money by the British. They were obviously trying to reduce sanctions and gain some money from the Americans. So, you know, I kind of fit that mold perfectly. And as I said, you know, each one they're a little different, but they always create these stories. Unfortunately, you know, there's never been a downside or penalty for this behavior. And I think, you know, it's something that I know Siamak and I, you know, it's painful to know that what you've been through, the interrogations, the tortures, the separation from your families, everything. And we, you know, we finally get out, and after a while, it's almost like nothing has happened. There's no way, no one's come up with a way of punishing the regime for taking hostages. And I can tell you, I've had these discussions with senior members of both the Biden and the current administration about, you know, you have to be going after these people. You can't just let this fly like this. It's just not, it's not humane. And of course, you all know that a lot of these regime insiders, their families are living in the US, in Canada, EU, Australia. They've took out huge amounts of money, some of them, well, a lot of it, in exactly the method that Siamak described. You know, there were cases, the guy got a $200 million loan. He spent a few minutes, I mean, a few million on buying a bunch of equipment, and the rest of the money wound up in Australia. And of course, he wound up in prison with us. But I mean, it's there has to be a way of punishing them for these bad actions.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, Morad, but we do need to move on. I will note that this is something that's been a passion of mine because I've represented many American hostages over many years. And I did publish an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal a couple of years ago, talking about how what I think we need is, you know, disproportionate disincentives, disproportionate consequences of the taking of hostages. And my own suggestion, which I continue to talk with the Trump administration about, and every administration, is the idea of doing some kind of a multilateral executive agreement where states that have hostages taken can come together and agree on collective consequences that they would impose when a single hostage is taken, and then more severe ones when there's a pattern and practice of hostage taking. The State Department recently announced that they're now going to start designating state sponsors of hostage taking, of wrongful detention. I think that's a small step in the right direction. So, Siamak, let me turn back to you in just a moment. But first, for those on the call with Harvard IDs, it's now time to begin to submit some questions, please. You can click on the Q&A button on your Zoom. In your questions, please introduce yourself briefly, keep the question short, and ask a question. And then thank you very much to all the panelists for keeping to time. And if I could just ask in the second round, if we could all speak a little bit shorter, I want to make sure we have plenty of time for Q&A as well. So Siamak, back to you. For years, Iran, of course, has relied on asymmetric deterrence through proxies like Hezbollah, Hamas, and regional militias. But Hezbollah is badly weakened, Gaza reshaped regional politics, and Iran has faced already direct strikes from Israel and the US. And so my question for you as we turn to some of the more geostrategic questions is, has Iran's deterrence model fundamentally failed? And what is your take on whether that might make the regime more cautious or more prone to escalation?
Jared, I thought we agreed we give the tough questions to Morad. What happened to our deal?
I just like giving it right to you, Siamak, after all those years of pro bono work.
Thank you. Yeah. As you described, for years, the Islamic Republic has been using this so-called forward defense tactic, which is using its proxies, Hezbollah, Hamas, militias, to gain some strategic depth, basically to insulate itself. Now, that insulation, to be generous, we can say it's been thinned dramatically over the past couple of years. And then last summer, Iran itself was hit. Now, the 12-day war was beyond humiliating. Losing the top brass of your military for any country, for any regime, is humiliation in a matter of hours, by the way. Losing control of the skies and having the supreme leader, he still is effectively in hiding. Yeah, we can say that that was deeply, deeply humiliating, especially for a regime that's obsessed with projecting this image of invincibility, right? That's what they've been feeding us. So that's all gone. What is the regime doing now to replace that deterrence? I would say they're signaling. What are they signaling? They're saying, well, they'll try any official who can get on there and anywhere that would have them, gets on and says the same message. We made a mistake last time being so restrained in our response. This time, we're going to expand the war. We're going to target US bases. Nowhere is going to be safe. And definitely, this will not be a quick or contained war like the last time. And that is how they're trying to compensate for their weakened proxies. Now, I'm not a military analyst, and I can't evaluate those threats, but I could say that that's the tactic that they're currently using. Now, there's another deterrence that Iran used to enjoy in decision circles in Washington, which is less talked about. I remember for decades, especially in Bush 43 administration, the argument in Washington against military strikes wasn't military, it was political. The argument was that the Iranian people, the vast majority of them, are extremely against the regime and pro-American. They're also extremely nationalistic, and bombing them would make them rally around the flag, and you would lose this pro-American population for generations to come. And that was a deterrent. Now, the population is split. We have an anti-interventionist camp. They disagree they remain nationalistic and disagree. They're very suspicious of any sort of military strike and the goals behind that. And then there's another group that is so desperate to end this regime in any way possible that they're openly calling for strikes and welcoming them. Now, so that silent deterrent is weakened, and we can talk about, we can debate percentages of who falls and what percentage is in which camp today in Iran, but we can't deny that there's a large swath of Iranians who are now welcoming strikes. But Jared, there's another part of this whole debate about the looming war, whether it happens or not, that I think it would be remiss of me not to mention. What happened? The President of the United States urged the Iranian people to stay out in the street, promising that the cavalry's on the way. He said that 8 times by my count. Many listened. They went out on the street and they got slaughtered. The cavalry never came. Suddenly the debate is shifted is about Iran's nuclear capability and missiles and its proxies. This is what I know. Whether or not there'll be a military strike, whether there'll be a military strike or the US will ultimately strike a deal, neither of those moves will undo the carnage that already took place. It won't stop the regime violence against its own people. The violence that we said we wouldn't allow.
Thanks so much for that profound and tragic observation, Siamak. Undoubtedly, many people came to the streets expecting international support, and so far have been bitterly disappointed. And this is a very difficult set of calculus to weigh, going in one way or another. Neda, let me turn back to you because a lot of the discussion, especially in light of kind of public reporting around Khamenei being, number one, old and sick, and number two, not really even being in charge. If you were to look at Farnaz Fassihi's recent article in the New York Times, raises a significant question as to what might happen when he ultimately dies. Some argue the system is institutionalized enough to survive, and others see it as deeply personalized and brittle. And I'm curious, from your perspective, what do you think happens when he dies? Are we talking a smooth transition, elite infighting, something totally unpredictable? And where would the Iranian people, civil society, and activists fit in that moment? And then, of course, what should the international community be doing in the context of that set of circumstances to support the Iranian people? You're still on mute.
Sorry about that. It happens periodically. I think, first, because a couple of caveats I think that we have to put in there is that we have society moving beyond the regime morally, but in terms of what happens next, I think a lot in terms of the next month, whether, as Siamak has laid out, the ethical parameters and very much the horrifying ramifications of what has transpired over the course of January. So what comes in the next month will tell us a lot. And if Khamenei survives, and if the Islamic Republic survives, to that question, secession is the Islamic Republic's, after its survival, it's an endurance regime. So after survival, its most significant structural vulnerability is succession. And it's not as if it's an unplanned one. For over the course of at least the last year that we're aware of, since the 12-day war, Khamenei has publicly acknowledged and prepared for transition. And the regime understands that leadership succession is amongst its most delicate institutional moments. And so it's not improvising. The Islamic Republic is institutionalized, but we have to understand it's also around diffusion. Clerical legitimacy, whether or not we consider it legitimate anymore or not, anchored in Velayat Fari, and a security enforcement anchored in the IRGC. So very much to your question, I would say that it's highly likely the next leader will remain a cleric. I know that there are numerous people out there that have said it'll be a council, it's going to be the IRGC. But I would say that abandoning the doctrine of the jurist would rupture the regime's ideological foundation, right? It's already ruptured from society, but again, its own labeling of itself as an Islamic state, that Islamic character of the state, for it is not cosmetic. For them, it's constitutional, regardless of what has transpired over the last however many years with society. So from their point of view, it's a constitutional matter. It's who they have defined the state to be, as Hadi very much actually very clearly put it out. They are the definers of the state. And so I think one of the other analytical points about succession is that it's not going to hinge per se on theology, despite its self-labeling and characterization. It will hinge on elite cohesion, particularly with the coercive and economic core of the regime. And how it has survived repeated crises is not per se exactly broad legitimacy as we've discussed tonight. It's because the elite coalition has remained sufficiently aligned around three shared interests: preservation of the system, protection of economic patronage networks, and prevention of accountability for the repression and the crimes against humanity that they've committed. That coalition spans clerical institutions, the IRGC, parastatal economic entities, and segments of the political classes. It's not harmonious, but it is mutually dependent. And so I would say over the course of 2 decades, we have seen a massive securitization of that coalition. And the IRGC is no longer simply, as it was in the beginning, defending the system. It's embedded, it's in the economic and political architecture. It protects the clerical authority, but it also constrains it. So I think in sum, a clerical successor operating within the parameters shaped by a security-dominated elite will have the consensus of the existing state. So in that sense, it may preserve religion, ostensible religion, while further consolidating security substance. And as you get, I use religion here again, ostensibly, very loosely. I do think that there will be some stressors, and those will be around distribution of rents, the corruption. Both Siamak and Hadi and Morad have talked about the distribution of rents, influence, institutional primacy, economic contraction. If it continues to combust, resources will shrink, so elite bargaining will become harder. So in that sense, again, if the regime survives and Khamenei passes in this way, I think the scarcity that Siamak laid out becomes even more and more fragile, and this corruption and insolvency will, in many ways, implode.
Sorry to interrupt, Neda. We need to move on from here. Thank you. So Hadi, back to you. There is, of course, lots of discussion right now of nuclear diplomacy, even as U.S. military assets have been built up to very, very high historic levels in the region, where in past circumstances when the U.S. has deployed this level of military assets, strikes almost always happen. It doesn't mean it has to happen in this case. Ultimately, that's the decision the president's going to have to make. But historically, when tensions are high, when military options are on the table, human rights concerns are the first thing to be forgotten in the middle of these kinds of intense negotiations. How do you see human rights being integrated into any potential agreement with Iran in light of that long history of discussions on nuclear issues, almost always overshadowing questions of human rights? Is it unrealistic to think that with this high stakes security diplomacy moment that human rights will get any attention at all?
Excellent question, Jared. And in order to delve into answering it, I want to first make a couple of points. One is that these negotiations have never, ever included anyone who represented the interests of the Iranian people. It has always been the Islamic Republic and its very own interests, which, as we have demonstrated by now, is completely separated from 90 million subjects and citizens of that land. Secondly, since 2004, when I remember the very first round of negotiations began by what then was called P5+1, the three European powers plus Russia, China, and the US, the negotiators have always, very explicitly and in our face, when we held meetings with them and demanded from these different countries that they should have a human rights angle, they always have basically been like, human rights is a soft issue and these are hard nuclear issues. And therefore, you guys are simpletons by wanting us to complicate these very complicated negotiations by including human rights. There is that history of foreign policy establishment in many diplomatic circles who have engaged with Iran. Now we're down to 1+1, US and Iran, with a country like Oman sitting in between. So no, I do not unfortunately expect human rights to become, but as a matter of principle, it should. Again, on the aftermath of such a massacre and crime against humanity, this government is a present and clear danger to its own citizens, as we have seen over 48 hours. And I'm sorry, the nuclear issue is not a present and clear danger. Much of that nuclear infrastructure is inside the mountains, bombed out, and not functional. It is not like they are about to build a bomb, which obviously would be a problem. But I'm just saying the priorities are very much misplaced at the moment. And I'm very sorry about that. But at the same time, I do believe that the international community and many governments are failing the Iranian people by not taking other actions right now that should be urgently needed, including a referral of Islamic Republic leaders to ICC for indictment under crimes against humanity. Just like Putin has been, just like other heads of state who have engaged in such behavior have been indicted. I don't understand why there's absolutely no discussion of that in any of the foreign policy circles and governments who can push that forward. Secondly, Iran should be expelled, or Islamic Republic should be expelled from or suspended from every international organization. There is very little being done on that. Iranian ambassadors should have been expelled from as many countries as possible, and diplomatic relations should have been downgraded to the minimum. So I don't see, and I see that as a failure of international human rights law, actually, right now, at how weak the institutions that should be upholding it have become. And at the same time, we really have lost our moral compass. If a month and a half has passed from this massacre and none of these steps are taken, and all we're talking about is the nuclear negotiations for something that, again, is not present and clear danger. Obviously, it's something that has been going on for 20 years and has to be addressed. But no, these negotiations are completely misplaced, and I'm very, very disappointed that the Iranian people's interest is nowhere to be seen in what is going on during this.
Thanks so much. Before we turn to questions, Morad, I'm going to turn last to you and take us in a little bit of a different direction, which is that in prison you turned to art as a way to preserve your identity and your humanity in an environment designed to erase both. And I want to get a little bit of your reflections as we see this beautiful artwork on the screen. I mean, really stunning images that you drew. How did artwork help you survive psychologically, and what does it say to you about the resilience of people inside a system built on repression?
Thank you, Jared. There were actually two elements that were instrumental in my own ability to survive my incarceration. One was nature, and the other art. And nature was the topic of all my artwork, as you're seeing on the screen. Initially, when I was in solitary, which I was there for 4 months, I had nothing to read, nothing to look at, not even the luxury of looking at the sky. The lights were kept on 24 hours a day. I started studying the grayish stone walls, and after a while, I started seeing the shapes and forms of animals in the lines and grains of the stone. I discovered lions, elephants, cheetahs, bears, birds, and many others. Every day, for hours and hours, in between interrogation sessions and torture, I would take refuge amongst the animals. It took a huge amount of effort and concentration and discipline just to memorize and recall where I had seen all these animals. At one point, I was able to count up to 47 different animals and birds in a cell no larger than 6 by 8 feet. And they could control every aspect of my life while I was in that IRGC facility. The one thing they could not control was my imagination. After 2 years at the IRGC detention center, I was moved to a public ward where became roommates with Siamak, and I was allowed to have pen and paper. So I started sketching, first from memory, and then from books and pictures that we were able to smuggle in. I discovered the little woodworking shop and started engraving on some stones. And all of these were decisions that I could make myself without any interference, if you will, by anyone in terms of what I could imagine and what I could do. And in that sense, every drawing, every sculpture, every design that I did was a success for me. And there weren't big successes, obviously, but there were successes. I had accomplished something. It's something that I woke up in the morning that I like to get involved in and started sketching and drawing or sculpting wood. But the ability to do that, to make those decisions by myself, it always gave me a sense that, you know, in this ugly place that we're being held, you can find beauty. And I found for myself what was something that allowed me to persevere, not only just while I was there, but it allowed me to contain whatever bitterness that had taken over while I was incarcerated there. As I've continued, as I've come out of Evin and came back to the United States, I have continued doing art. And to me, I mean, it's just mentally an incredibly helpful tool. I hope, you know, you enjoyed the pictures. That was a small section of everything I did, for lack of time.
Thanks so much, Hadi, for that and for those beautiful images. We are, of course, coming towards the end of this time. We're going to go just a few minutes late. There have been a number of questions asked in the chat box, and so I think we're going to do a speed round here. No more than 2 minutes from each panelist of final remarks. Let me tee up two sets of questions that have been asked, and you can either address one question or the other question, or you can make a final comment of your own if you don't want to address either question. But I do hope someone will at least address the two sets of questions, because we've had multiple people ask similar questions. So the first question is, and I've just kind of consolidated across people. These were asked by Mana Javadi at 3L at the law school, Nima Gassour at the School of Public Health, and others. What is your view of the movement for Reza Pahlavi, the son of the Shah of Iran, to lead Iran through a transition process? Are the people of Iran calling for this? Is this overhyped in the Western media or something else? And are there other lesser known figures that you might highlight that have credibility with the Iranian people? So the first question is really, who might lead a democratic transition process? The second question, coming from Naveed at HKS, Avi, a mid-career at HKS, how do we get the world to focus on the gross human rights abuses in Iran when so few are talking about it, let alone taking action? And what more can the Iranian diaspora do to try to help the people of Iran? So we will please answer one question or the other, or make a final comment of your own. And why don't we start with Siamak this time? No more than 2 minutes, please.
Well, the first question, I think answering it properly is close to suicidal. I think I answered it.
I hope someone gives it a try, though.
Sure. I vote for Morad. Look, there are, in an ideal world, what we need to do is to get the security apparatus of the Islamic Republic to stop shooting at people. You have to get them to defect. Any organization, one of my hopefully constructive criticisms of what's going on right now among the diaspora and some of the groups, other groups in Iran, it's an emotional time. The regime has slaughtered people in ways that was described very well by Neda and Hadi. But if we want to defeat the evil regime doing that, we have to use our brain. Saying that we're going to hang people off of every lamppost is not going to encourage people to defect. So I'll answer it this way. I think what we need to do is to be much more inclusive and to have the democratic voices within Iran, and there's plenty of them. As I said, Evin Prison is really a breeding ground for them. People on the ground that have the civil society access and roots and ability to organize, and then for the outside groups to give them the voice and the access that they need. We need all of us to increase our tolerance, to increase our inclusivity, and that would be a much more viable opposition than we forced together today. I think we got a long way to go as the voices of opposition outside of Iran.
Thanks so much, Siamak. Neda, how about your answering one question the other or making your own comment?
I would love to do a combination. To Siamak's point of maybe this is not the best idea to answer it, but this is Harvard, so you take political theory classes, you've taken history classes. State formation is violent, and it proceeds to be violent. There are civil wars that happen, and when you have civil war and the state falls apart, it proceeds to continue to be violent, and the state continues to maintain levels of violence via sacrifice. To Siamak's point of a coalition of internal democratic leaders is the best option. And when we look at countries that have done post-conflict or transitional projects, that's the best way to go about it. But as I hate to say maybe and I use it lightly here, but the realist, the overwhelming violence to be expected should not be shortchanged. There is a long-standing, and it used to be referred to, CIA report about the kind of violence that would come internally to Iran amongst its own people. And I think that we have seen that in the last 6 weeks, the state against the people. Until, as Siamak was pointing out, that there is some discussion of defection and the military comes over, I don't foresee that stopping without additional, stronger, coercive violence. And if I can, to answer the question who was asked by the law student, and in reflection of Hadi's comments earlier about negotiations, I was also at the Center for the Defenders of Human Rights, and somebody you didn't mention who was there was Mr. Abdul Fattah Soltani. He's a Nuremberg Prize winner. And when I was there as a student, he said, don't ever forget, human rights are for sale when it comes to the United States. So again, not to be a cynic or too much of a realist, but that is what I was taught very early from inside of Iran. And so for the law students, you have Hadi, you have myself, you have people who have been working on this, and it's extremely emotional, extremely difficult. I mean, Jared is on, and I don't really have words beyond that. It's very, very difficult. My last thing, if I can chime in one more on what we're talking about, is in terms of there was a student who asked about what you can do. There are organizations that very much want your help. Hadi leads one. I have to tell you, the one that I lead has literally been campaigning on Capitol Hill to get the internet turned back on. Literally. Well, the whole world was screaming about the internet. We passed legislation and just Congress didn't give funding. You can help be that voice to argue for human rights. You can be that voice to get the internet turned back on, and a holistic internet system of VPNs and links Starlink, there are a lot of things you can do that way. So I know I went over my time, but thank you.
Thanks, Morad. Let me turn to you. No more than hopefully 2 or 3 minutes as we wrap it up.
All right.
Bring it to Hadi to finish it out.
Okay. I, in large part, agree with Siamak. I think we've seen so much inside Evin and so much of the existing system, so many of the different opposition groups, from Democrats to Mujahideen, I mean, you name it, Kurdish separatists, Azerbaijan separatists. I mean, you'll lose count how many there are. They are definitely not cohesive in their relationships. Each has their own agenda, and it's a big problem. In the case that we have in Iran right now, people are not coming together. These various groups are not coming together, neither the ones outside Iran nor the ones inside. And the regime has been very smart about now taking leaders of probably the most prominent internal opposition, which they sometimes call themselves the Group of 17, with Narges Mohammadi is one of them, obviously. I mean, they parked her out in Mashhad. They parked another friend or person that Siamak and I know very well, Dr. Madani, in Damavand. The latest one, which was another friend of ours, Mehdi Mahmoudian, he did a BBC interview and just kind of blasted the whole system. And I was in touch with him pretty much every 3 or 4 days. And then they went out and they got him, and they parked him out on the Caspian coast somewhere in some prison. So what they've done, as before, when Siamak and I were in Evin, all these people were there together. What they're doing now is they're splitting them up, so they can't communicate with each other. They can't bring their factions together. So I mean, it's a huge challenge. Obviously, there's not a lot of funding to go around for these things. And those are things that I think we can help. I think those are things that the United States government could help even in finding sources of funding for these movements. And you have to build a coalition. There's no question about it. Otherwise, it's just not going to work.
Hadi, let me turn to you last, but of course not least, to wrap it up for us. What are your thoughts on the questions I asked, or your own views?
These are, again, historical times, and that is the key question, believe me, for anyone who cares for Iran and sees themselves. There is a historical responsibility on our shoulders, on all our shoulders right now, inside and outside the country. So first of all, let me say the key is exactly what Siamak said. We have to get rank and file, especially, if not middle commanders and higher commanders, to defect. And I think it is possible, actually, just the proper situation has not been laid out, precisely because, as Siamak also said, there are people going around and saying, we're going to hang you from electric poles in every city, and every electric pole will have a cleric hanging from it, and this and that. That's frightening them. But let me also go back to Mehdi Mahmoudian, one of the 17 coalition members in Iran that Morad brought up. He has given a very interesting anecdote recently. That last time he was in Evin Prison, the deputy head of the prison, this is not, again, just some interrogator who happened to maybe be not completely loyal to the government. This is deputy head of the prison. Talking to him, asked him, why are you a reformist? This regime is collapsing. Meaning that people within the regime realize that it is over. And if they are given a proper option, an opportunity to join something new, they will. Now, again, coalition is the ultimate answer. Everyone has to come together, regardless of their differences. This is pretty much well known in all kinds of, especially struggles in diaspora and governments in exile. And when a regime is so powerful that you have to put away your differences and focus on your commonalities. And much of the opposition has one common thread. They want the Islamic Republic to go. And I can assure you that there are discussions been happening. The key to it, again, because people inside the country cannot stick their head out or be very effective in acting on this coalition. The key thing is that they send people out or they delegate to those of us who are outside, to the diaspora members. And that is happening. And right now, there are efforts that I hope will soon bear fruit to convene a National Assembly by end of March of diaspora groups representing everyone, hopefully. And of course, we do have one group who are the Reza Pahlavi loyalists who will be the toughest to bring into a coalition, since they believe they have enough support to run things on their own if needed. But at least Reza Pahlavi has written publicly, such as an op-ed in Washington Post recently, that he does not represent everyone, and yes, he has to be part of a coalition. But first, we need this National Assembly to come to existence, have legitimacy on behalf of political forces inside the country, and hopefully by the freedoms they have abroad, they can start challenging the Islamic Republic, and that would be an ideal way of going forward. And then transitional justice, where we assure people. So, for example, our organization had just produced a movie about the aftermath of Islamic Republic, a docudrama, hoping to release it next month, of one of the notorious.
I'm sorry, we're gonna have to end this here.
It's about transitional justice and how do we put these people on trial in the aftermath rather than massacring and repeating the evil they committed against the people.
No, thanks so much, Hadi. We are over time, and I really thank the audience for your patience. As I wrap up here, as an international human rights lawyer myself, I'd be remiss if I didn't remind the audience that there are actually, as we speak now, several dual national and U.S.-Iran hostages in Iran today, in Evin Prison and elsewhere. There's also a larger number of dual national victims of coercive exit bans, people that are in jail and facing manufactured charges. And it's always a struggle to make sure that their stories don't get lost, which is why I needed to highlight it here. Thank you to our distinguished panelists for joining, to Matthias for the introduction, to the staff at the IOP for organizing the event, and to the Carr Ryan Center for co-hosting. Thanks so much, everyone, and have a good night.
Thank you.